Okay, team. So here we're looking at the Java API for the class Throwable. So we've learned the keyword throw, and now we're looking at the object type Throwable. And we can see that it directly extends object, right? We implicitly do that no matter what. And then it has two known subclasses or two children classes, error and exception. Let's read a little bit more about this. So the Throwable class is the superclass of all errors and exceptions in Java language. Only instances of only objects that are instances of the class or one of its subclasses, obviously, are able to be thrown by the virtual machine, the Java virtual machine. That's how we think about it when Java code, like Java developers wrote code that then throws an exception, or thrown by us in using the Java throw statement. Similarly, only this class or one of its subclasses can be the argument to a catch clause. Remember, we have catch and then the parentheses, the type of the exception. So it's got to be something of throwable or one of its subclasses. Okay, now for the purpose of compile time checking of exceptions, Throwable and any subclass of Throwable that is not also a subclass of either runtime exception or error are regarded as checked exceptions. And we're going to talk more about checked versus unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions we're going to think about as ones where we are communicating with other developers, and unchecked exceptions are going to be ones where a programmer did something wrong, and we just need to communicate that this is an error that happened. We are less likely to warn people about those types of exceptions, or we aren't required to warn people about that. Two instances of two subclasses, error and exception, are conventionally used to indicate that an exceptional situation has occurred. Okay, that maybe part is not that surprising. So now what I want to do is I want to look at error and exception. Okay, so here I've got some screenshots from the Java API looking at the class exception, so on the left-hand side, and you can see that it's a child class of Throwable. And then on the right-hand side, I have a little bit of the description. Excuse me, so it's public class exception extends Throwable. So then it says the class exception and its subclasses are a form of Throwable that indicates conditions that a reasonable application might want to catch. And this is going to be in contrast to error. And the class exception and any subclasses that are not also subclasses of runtime exception are checked exceptions. And we'll talk about this in the next walkthrough, but checked exceptions need to be declared in a method or constructor's throws clause if they can be thrown by the execution of the method or constructor and propagate outside the method or constructor boundary. Okay, we're going to talk more about what that piece means, but this is just saying, okay, we've got object, throwable, exception. Now let's look at error. Okay, so error 2 is a child class of Throwable, and on the right-hand side, you can see public class error extends Throwable. Okay, not surprising. An error is a subclass of Throwable that indicates serious problems that a reasonable application should not try to catch. Most such errors are abnormal conditions. Then here, a side note, the thread death error, though a normal condition, is also a subclass of error because most applications should not try to catch it. So we still throw it, and an application might be able to see that there's an error, log some stuff, but then it still will throw it and pass that error on up. So anybody who called it, who is sort of in this path of the error, can see it, but really shouldn't catch it permanently. They might catch it for a time, log something about what happened, and then throw it again. Okay, team, one last piece to look at, and that is the runtime exception. You can see it's object, and then Throwable extends object, exception extends Throwable, and runtime exception extends exception. And on the right-hand side, we've got public class runtime exception extends exception. Runtime exception is the superclass of those exceptions that can be thrown during the normal operation of the Java virtual machine. Runtime exception and its subclasses are unchecked exceptions. We'll talk more about that. Unchecked exceptions do not need to be declared in a method or constructor throws clause. You're like, we haven't talked about throws clause. Again, we'll talk about that in the next walkthrough. If they can be thrown by the execution of the method or constructor and propagate outside the method or constructor boundary. Okay, just as a little review, we've looked at runtime exceptions, which are a type of exception. Then in Throwable, we've looked at both exceptions and errors. Those were the known subclasses of Throwable. Again, we're going to dive into the logistics of all this, but I think we just want to try and demystify, like, all this information is described online in the Java API. It actually can be pretty helpful.